Greetings and salutations, everyone, for another installment of a reaction video, Old Testament Academic Reacts. Last week, if you watched, we went through Answers in Genesis and their critique of old earth creationism and theory of evolution, and how they present this as a false dichotomy, in that you're either biblical and a young earth creationist, or you're unbiblical and an old earth creationist, or you hold to the theory of evolution. This week it looks like, from this slide here, that he's going to go into agnosticism. Those Christians who are agnostic about creationism, I suppose. So, without further ado, we'll just jump right into this. If you do like this sort of stuff, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. And it wouldn't hurt as well if you guys left a comment or two. So, without further ado, here we go.
We just really can't know for sure about this. The Bible doesn't give us enough information. Wayne Grudem in his systematic theology says this, which, by the way, this is probably the most popular systematic theology out there in evangelical seminaries and churches. Therefore, with respect to the length of days in Genesis 1, the possibility must be left open that God has chosen not to give us enough information to come to a clear decision on this question, and the real test of faithfulness to him may be the degree to which we can act charitably toward those who, in good conscience and full belief in God's word, hold to a different position on this matter. Now, I like the sentiment that we need to be civil and act charitably toward those, and I hope that I'm doing that today when I go through these quotations. That's my goal. But really, God hasn't given us enough information as to how long each of the days were?
That's because God allows us to discover. God has allowed his creation to discover the world and the universe that he created. That's what he does. It's not like that he's deceitfully or willingly it's not like that he's deceitfully holding back information. He's allowing us through free will to discover his creation. He's allowing his creation to discover his creation, if you will, please. There's nothing sinister or dark about that, or even evil. So, I think Chafee here is misunderstood, or is misunderstanding that God does allow his creation to discover his creation, that he allows us, humanity's crowning achievement, to discover his universe and the world. So, just a counterpoint there for him, but we'll see where he goes and continues.
The Bible tells us very clearly in many cases, as we've already looked at, many places it tells us how long those days were. They were normal length days.
Agree. Absolutely. Walton, Dr. John Walton, and Dr. Tremper Longman III, and me included, they're 24-hour literal days. That's what's going on there. Absolutely. Agreed. But you have to understand that it's also wrapped in poetry, and I'm assuming he's going to talk about that, because that is one of our arguments, is that it's the creation of the universe and everything in it wrapped in prose and poetry. So we'll see if he continues here.
J.P. Moreland said, I'm an old earth creationist 5 days out of the week. I'm a young earth creationist 2 days out of the week. Why does he say something like that?
Witty.
And I heard Norm Geisler say something very similar. In fact, he told me personally that very similar. I handed him a copy of my book, Old Earth Creationism on Trial, which his presentation is based on. And I told him, I said, you know, I really respect a lot of what you've done and your works, and I've read a lot of your books, but when it comes to this issue, I think that you've dropped the ball quite a bit. Now I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember my exact words, but he said, well, I think you'd find I agree with you 3 days out of the week. Why are they saying things like that?
I'm sorry, I'm not laughing. I'm laughing at the comment that Moreland said here still.
Because I think they know what the Bible really teaches on this, and yet for whatever reason they want to allow for the millions and the billions of years. And we'll come back to some of that in a little bit, some of their arguments for that. Some people will say, well, Genesis chapter 1 is just poetic, or it's semi-poetic. Rob Bell calls it the creation poem. Meredith Klein talked about the semi-poetic form of Genesis chapter 1. He popularized what's known as the framework hypothesis, which we'll look at in a little bit. Hugh Ross, who's one of the best known old earth creationists, he believes in what's called progressive creation. It's kind of a spin-off of the day-age view, where each of the days of creation are long periods of time, he will often take poetic passages, interpret those literally, and then use those to reinterpret the narrative passages. Genesis chapter 1 is narrative. So let's take a look at that real quick. It is written...
No, it's not. Genesis 1 is poetry. It's prose. It's not historical narrative. You see the anaphorisms, and God said. You see the anaphorism, and God said, and God said, and God said, on this day, on this day, on this day. Then you've got the days 1 through 3 match days 4 through 6. You have day 1, God creating light. Guess what he created on day 4? The sun, moon, and stars. And you see that pattern repeated throughout the first chapter of the book because it's a temple text. It's God creating the universe and everything in it, and then assuming rulership by sitting on his throne that day of rest. That's what that means. He's assuming rulership of the universe and creation. It, honestly, in my opinion, others will probably share the same view. I think it glorifies God tremendously by saying he created the universe and everything in it, and then he assumes rulership, as he should, because he is the creator. Absolutely. So I have no problem interpreting this passage poetically or in prose, if you will. But yes, Chafee, it's written in prose. It's written in prose. It's not historical narrative here. You'll find Genesis 2 is also prose.
In the same style as the rest of Genesis, except for chapter 49, which is largely poetic when Jacob is blessing his sons, and a few other, spoken places in Genesis where those things are in poetry. But it's written as historical narrative prose, and it has a repeated use of what's known as the Vav consecutive imperfect. So it's this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this. It's sort of like reading a history book today. When you read through a history book, you're reading this happened, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then...
He's right. He's absolutely right. It's right. It's written in the Vav. It's written in the Yiktol, the Vav consecutive imperfect, which is usually used for prose. It's this, and then this, and then this is usually how it's translated. And then you've got the converse Vav. But it's written it's still written in prose. Usually, if I'm not mistaken here, the Vav consecutive imperfect is usually written for prose. It's written sequentially. That is, it's written out, at least in Genesis 1, it's written out for events happening in sequential order. It's called an anaphorism in this case. It's called an anaphorism. And that's what's being led here. There are other poetic, literary devices here. Anaphorism is one. Then you've got, it's not even just, and God said, and God said, and God said. It's also, and it was so. And it was so. And it was good. And then on the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, and again, like I just said about 5 seconds ago, the first 3 days match the latter 3 days. Days 1 through 3 match days 4 through 6. That's poetry.
And this, and it's usually...
Oh, and before he continues here about chapter 49, so he's going to take everything in chapter 49 literally. I don't think I brought up my, I don't think I brought up my logos here. Should have before the stream. Let me just get that out. Let me just get that up here. Give it a minute here, and we'll do this. The problem is, if he takes Genesis 49 literally, he's going to have the same problem. Going to have the same problem. Because Genesis 49, if I'm not mistaken, Genesis 49 here is going to, I think it's the passage Jacob goes through and pronounces blessings and curses over his sons. So they're already in Egypt in Genesis 49. So they're already in Egypt by Genesis 49, and the famine's going on, and Joseph is telling them there's a famine and it's going to be for 7 years. And he tells them to live in the land of Goshen. So if we pick that up here, we'll do the ESV. Give it some time here because it's trying to. There we go, and then we'll do the BHS. Okay. So we'll bring up the BHS. Here we go, and we will. Can we? I don't know if I can leak that or not. Anyway, so Genesis 49, and we'll do the English Standard. Genesis 49. Now on the record here. See, yeah. So, yeah. Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come." Now, this is interesting here because you don't have the anaphorisms that you do in Genesis 1. Again, this is poetry, if I'm not mistaken. This should be poetry. Because, you get, assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel, your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are the swords. So, what Jacob's doing here is he's going through each one. Ooh, I'm getting kind of loud there. He's going through each one of his sons. And he says, because you have done this, this is what's going to happen to you. So you see Simeon and Levi are brothers, their weapons of violence and their swords. Let my soul cry into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company, for in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger. Now, you don't, like I said, you don't have the Vayiktol here. You've got it in certain cases, like the first one, it's Vayikra Yaakov el Banav, Vayomer Heasbu, V'agida lakren et asher yikra. That's just imperative, the yikra here. Sorry, read the Hebrew. This is just imperative, or imperfect. That's not the Vayiktol. Etchem b achareth chayamen. Okay? In the days to come. So, I really struggle with his interpretation here that Genesis 49 is written just like Genesis 1. If he's going to call this historical narrative. I guarantee you this is poetry too. Actually, I'm not going to guarantee that. But this is definitely, this just reads poetry to me. He's pronouncing blessings or curses based on their past actions. That's all that's going on there. So, to continue here, we'll go on.
In order. Sometimes you got to back up and explain something else that you kind of glossed over, but for the most part it's in order. But that's very different than poetry. Even in Hebrew, when you go through this, that occurs more than 1.5 times per verse in narrative passages, and in, for example, Genesis 49, which is largely poetic, just 1 out of every 3 verses. So it's very easy to tell just from the use of what's known as the Vav consecutive imperfect, is this going to be a narrative or poetic passage? So here's what I want to show you, and it's very easy to pick up.
But it can still be considered poetry, even though it doesn't use that anaphoristic literary device. You can use...
in English, and it would be for anybody who is an expert in Hebrew, it'd be easy for them to pick up on this. The difference between poetry and narrative, because in Exodus chapter 14, you have the narrative account of the Israelites going through the Red Sea, crossing on dry ground. And then in Exodus 15, the very next chapter, you have the song that the Israelites sing. It's the poetic version of that same event. And you can do the same thing in Judges chapter 4 and 5 with Deborah and Barak and the battle against Sisera, Judges 5 and 6, I think it is, where the first chapter there is narrative, the next one is this song, and it's poetic. And you can see how things are worded very differently. So let's take a look at this. Exodus chapter 14. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Pretty easy to see. This is historical narrative. This is just telling you, here's what happened, then this, and then this, and then this. It's just a straight description of what happened. Now let's take a look at the poetic verse.
With the exception of Moses stretching out over his hand over Egypt, that reeks of Egyptian iconography with the pharaohs stretching out their hands. Other than that, he's absolutely right. This is written in historical narrative. And he's going to go to Exodus 15, and he's going to show and demonstrate that Exodus 15 is poetry as well. And he's absolutely right. It's poetry. It's written differently. It's a song of the sea, or it's the song in Exodus 15. And there's imagery in it. So what makes it historical narrative and what makes it prose and poetry is the thing. You have to decide what is prose and what is not prose and poetry. Exodus 15 is universally accepted as prose and poetry, and Exodus 14 is history or historical narrative. Absolutely, with the exception of Moses stretching out his hand over the sea. That seems rather poetic to me, and it tells me that it's got some Egyptian-ness in it, in that you see in Egyptian religious texts, pharaohs, kings of Egypt, pharaohs, stretching out their hands, usually to smite their enemies. Sorry, I'm looking over here. I should be looking. But that's what you have. Moses smiting, or God using Moses to smite his enemies. In a sort of way, Moses is the rod that God is using to strike the Egyptians here. It's poetry. That is a poet. I'm sorry, it's not poetry. This is imagery here. At least that. And then the rest of it is historical narrative. You had the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind. I forget what this is called. Dr. Falk knows this. My buddy Dr. Falk knows what this is called. It's a wind down or something. And the water recedes and then it comes back. I forget what that's called. If you could tell me, you can tell me. Let me know in the comments. But I forget what that's called. Especially in this part of Egypt with the lakes there. So, another thing he said is Red Sea. It's Reed Sea. Red Sea's based off of a mistranslation. It's Greek. Comes from the Septuagint, meaning red, which is how we get our common Red Sea. But the Hebrew word is Suf, which is an Egyptian word. It's an Egyptian LW. It's an Egyptian loan word that came into the Hebrew language. So,
version of this. The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea. His chosen captains are also drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them, they sank to the bottom like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, has become glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, has dashed the enemy in pieces.
You can clearly see the difference, I'm sure, between historical narrative and poetry here. You see the heightening of the writer here with the Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. It's intensifying. It's actually specification is what's going on here. So you have a statement in the first verse that, so each of the verses can be divided. So the first verse here of what he just said, the Lord is a man of war, and then you see the specification, the Lord is his name. And the second one you see Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea. His chosen captains, specification again, his chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. Should be Reed Sea, it's Yam Suf. So you see this, what you have in Hebrew poetry is this sort of heightening, and whether it's intensification, specification, or concretization. And you see that throughout Exodus 15 here, which is what separates it from historical narrative. It's absent. So I'll let him speak for a while.
If we are to take the poetic passage literally, as Hugh Ross often does when he looks at the Psalms and he looks at other places that mention creation, he'll take those ones literally and then try to force that and to reinterpret Genesis chapter 1. Here's what we learn in Exodus 15 if we take that literally. The Lord is a man with nostrils. Pharaoh's army was cast into the sea and drowned. They were dashed to pieces. They were consumed like stubble. They were swallowed by the earth. Which one was it? Well, those are all poetic ways of expressing the fact that they were completely destroyed.
Another thing I don't think he understands, maybe he does, I don't know. It doesn't seem like he grasps Near Eastern hyperbole. Pharaoh's army and his chariots were not destroyed completely, for one. Pharaoh wasn't even killed in the event. Did Pharaoh lose a significant amount of chariots? Absolutely. But we'll let him go on.
Okay? There's a huge difference between historical narrative and poetry, and it is often very easy to tell the difference. Genesis 1 is written as historical narrative. We can't reinterpret it just as poetry because...
Clearly written as poetry, bro. Clearly written as poetry. And you'll see that more when you get into out of the temple text and you get into the second creation account beginning in Genesis 2:4. And then when you get to Genesis 3, the writer heightens everything. Oh, the first sin was Eve taking the fruit? Guess what the next sin was? And then the next sin. And then the next sin. And it culminates in the flood and then eventually the Tower of Babel. So you see this heightening of sin from Genesis 3 all the way down to 11. Actually, before that, the flood is the height where God says he's going to destroy the world because of sin. But you see the heightening and intensification of sin. Someone, it was fruit. Then it was murder. Then it was Lamech who committed 2 murders in Genesis 4. And it goes on. And then it corrupts the whole earth. And then God is remorseful that he created, he's remorseful that he created humanity. So, I'm probably going to spend more time on this part. Let's go to Logos again here and go to Genesis 1 because there's something that is interesting here. Look, you've got here, Vayomer, okay? Vayikra, Vayar. He's absolutely right. These are anaphorisms. And God saw, and God said, and God called, and God said, and God made the firmament. And he divided the waters from underneath the firmament, from the waters above the firmament. And it was so. It was so is another anaphorism. He creates, what goes on in Genesis 1 is that he creates space. God created space, and then he filled it. Creates space, then he fills it. Then you've got creation. It's also got something, I'm sorry, my mind's going a mile a minute. So what's going on here as well, Chafee probably doesn't get, is if you compare Genesis 1, the creation account in Genesis 1 with the Enuma Elish, now he probably doesn't like the point that I'm comparing it with other A&E models, but oh well. So if you compare Genesis 1 with maybe the Baal cycle of Ugarit and the Enuma Elish, you see this battle between Baal in that cycle with the sea, and the Enuma Elish you see Marduk, or Asher if you're Assyrian mythology, war with Tiamat, who's indicative of the sea. And you see Marduk slay, he's with an arrow, slays Tiamat, and then uses half of her body for the waters below to create the oceans, and then the water above the firmament in that one. And then after that, he establishes order. He creates humanity out of her blood. If I'm not mistaken, it should be her blood and the dust of the ground. No. It was Kingu. I'm sorry. He uses Kingu and the dust of the earth, or he uses Kingu to create humanity. That's what it is. And then he brings out order. That's what happens. In the Baal cycle, it's the same thing. He creates order. He establishes order. He brings order into existence out of disorder. It's the same thing here. God brings order out of disorder in Genesis 1. My mind is going a mile a minute right now, so you have to forgive me if I stumble over words or whatever. But anyway, let's let him go on. Oh, there it is. That's what we want.
Because we want to try to do away with what it says to harmonize with the Bible with an outside idea of millions of years. So how about this one? Does the word day actually mean day? I told you we would come back to this. Here's what Norm Geisler wrote in his systematic theology book.
I agree.
On the second volume, he said, it is true that most often the Hebrew word yom, meaning day, means 24 hours. However, this is not definitive for its meaning in Genesis 1 for several reasons. So he's going to give us 3 reasons why we don't have to take it as...
I'm probably going to disagree with Norman Geisler here. These are 24-hour literal days. I will agree with Chafee here. These are 24-hour literal days.
A normal length day in Genesis chapter 1, which, by the way, not every use in Genesis 1. The very first use, God called the light day. That means the daylight portion of the day. But then it goes and says there was evening and morning the first day. He says, the meaning of a term is not determined by majority vote. That's true. But by the context in which it is used. Remember that, okay? The meaning of the term is determined by the context in which it is used. That's his first point. It is not important how many times it's used elsewhere, but how it is used here. And again, we agree. The word day is used, yom, is used over 2,300 times in the Old Testament. Why is it that really the only time we question its meaning is in Genesis chapter 1? I mean, nobody questions how long the Israelites marched around Jericho. Was it for 7,000 years before the walls came down, or was it for the 7 days? Nobody questions the meaning of it there. How long was Jonah in the belly of the great fish? Was it for 3 days, or were they 3,000 years or a million years? Nobody questions the meaning of the word day there.
No,
why is it just
Jonah's
in Genesis
poetry
chapter
too.
1,
it's satire.
People will try to reinterpret it. He goes on. Second, even in the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, day is used of more than a 24-hour period. Speaking of the whole 6 days of creation, Genesis 2:4 refers to it as the day.
I disagree with Geisler here.
When all things were created. That would be very similar to when we talk about back in the day, that it can mean a period of some length. It can be a week, it can be months, it can be back in when you were growing up, when you say back in the day. But again, it's determined by context. Remember, he already said that. But then he also said it's not important how it's used elsewhere. Remember, or how many times it's used elsewhere? Well, look at his third argument. Finally, yom is elsewhere used of long periods of time, as in Psalm 90, verse 4, which is cited in 2 Peter 3, a day is like 1,000 years. I thought we were just told it's not important how it's used elsewhere, but how it's used here. And then his third argument is to say it's used elsewhere as a long period of time. Do you see the problem? First of all, is 2 Peter 3:8 talking about creation? No, the context, remember the context is important, is about Christ's return. Yes, it seems like God has been waiting a long time. Even to Peter, who was writing at that point, it had been a couple decades, like how come Christ hasn't returned yet? Hey, it might seem like a long time to you, but it's not a long time to God. That's the context. It's not saying each of those days of creation was really 1,000 years. And by the way, even if we took that, even if we said, fine, you can have 1,000 years for each creation day, how old is the earth then? 12,000 years? Could that really get you close to the millions of years at all? No, it doesn't even come close to it. So that argument doesn't even hold up. And by the way, if you continue reading, it's quoted in Psalm 90, verse 4, it's a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. So if you continue reading, if you think there's a mathematical formula, 1 day equals 1,000 years, which equals 1 day. You're right back where you started.
100% agree with him. 100% agree with him here. I think Genesis 1, it's literal days, 6 literal days. He created the universe and everything in it. That's how the text reads. Now, I don't hold a young earth creationism, but that's what the text reads. 6 24-hour literal days. Jonah, in the satire book of Jonah, 3 literal days. Exodus 20, I think it's Exodus 20, literal days. I think this argument doesn't hold water. This bit of argument doesn't hold water, just like Chafee says. That doesn't undermine the arguments that old earth creationists, and evolutionists hold. That's what I'm trying to say as well. That doesn't undermine our arguments at all. But he's absolutely right. I disagree with Geisler on this as well.
It's really just talking about how God is beyond time. He's not bound by time like we are.
Way to properly
Some people will
exegete
say,
that.
well, day 6 is too short for everything that had to happen on that day. Gleason Archer, in his book, Survey of Old Testament Introduction, which, by the way, is an outstanding book for the most part, other than the chapter where this appears, says this: nevertheless, on the basis of internal evidence. Okay, remember that term, that phrase, internal evidence. He's going to tell us things from the text, at least that's what he says he's going to tell us, things from the text that tell you that we shouldn't interpret this as normal length days. He says, it is this writer's conviction that Yom in Genesis 1 could not have been intended by the Hebrew author to mean literal 24-hour day. Genesis 1:27 states that after creating all the land animals on the sixth day, God created man, both male and female. Then in the more detailed treatment of Genesis 2, we are told that God created Adam first, gave him the responsibility of tending the garden for some time until he observed him to be lonely. Then he granted him the fellowship of all the beasts and animals of the earth, with opportunity to bestow names upon them all. Some undetermined period after that, God observed that Adam was still lonely and finally fashioned a human wife for him by means of a rib removed from him during a deep sleep. Then at last he brought Eve before Adam and presented her to him as his new life partner. Who can imagine that all of these transactions could possibly have taken place in 120 minutes of the sixth day, or even within 24 hours for that matter? And yet Genesis 1:27 states that both Adam and Eve were created at the very end of the final day of creation.
Now, I don't know if he's going to go into it here, but there is clearly a contradiction here. Who was created first? Humanity, that is Adam and Eve, or the animals? That's one problem I have with this. And another problem I have with this is, I had the thought. Let me think here. Shoot. I thought I had it. He actually went into this. I'm kind of surprised he went into this second Genesis 2 here. Another thing he did. Oh, yeah. Another thing he mentioned here was the Garden of Eden. Now, it's interesting because in Mesopotamia, you had the ziggurat, and then you had a garden, and the priests tilled the garden. In Genesis 2 here, you see that laid out. You see that connection. You see that similarity laid out in Genesis 2. So, did God choose Mesopotamians to be priests of the garden? Or did God do it? Now, I know that sounds baffling because in Genesis 2, I kind of think, I kind of agree with Walt. I agree with Walton when he says that he took Adam and Eve and put them in the garden to work and till it, put the Imago Dei on them, and then told them to work the garden. Excuse me. Yes. That's what I believe. So I do hold to pre-Adamism, in that there were humans, other humans during the time and before. So, it's just on Adam and Eve, he put the Imago Dei on them. So, there were other humans in existence at the time. So, I'm not going to go into that now because that's not what this video is about. So, but absolutely, it's poetry. Again, you see the echoes of poetry here in Genesis 2, especially with on the sixth day. Now, I don't know if he's going to address that contradiction here. Well, was man created first? Were the animals created first? Hopefully he does. I'm interested to see his answer, but will he? I'm not sure. So, but definitely, it's unimaginative, or it is imaginative, if you will, to suggest all these things happen in 120 minutes of the sixth hour, of the sixth day, or even within the 24 hours, which is why we think it's poetry.
Whew. All right, long quote, lots of problems. You may have noticed something that all of those highlighted sections had in common. But then he goes on, he says, obviously the days of chapter 1 are intended to represent stages of unspecified length, not literal 24-hour days. All right, what are the problems with that? Well, notice all of those things I highlighted. What do they have in common? Besides the fact that they're not found in the text anywhere, with the exception of at last. All of them have to do with adding time to the account. And yet they're not in the text. Adam didn't have to name every single one of all the beasts and all the animals. He had to name certain ones that God had brought to him. It doesn't say he had the fellowship
Really?
of all these beasts, just, again, including time. And, still lonely, undetermined period after that. All these things to try to add time and then say, well, there's no way all that could happen in day 6. Yeah, of course, if you add a whole bunch of time, there's no way you can fit everything in there. But if you don't add all those time elements, if you're not inserting ideas into the Bible, if you just take it for what it says, yes, all of those things can happen on day 6, just like the Bible says. And I don't know where this 120 minutes thing comes from at all. He doesn't document it. He doesn't footnote it at all. He just says, who could possibly imagine that could happen in 120 minutes? Who says it has to? He's got 24 hours to make it happen.
That's why it sounds
And
like
then he
poetry.
says that the Bible says that Adam and Eve were made at the very end of the final day of creation in Genesis 1:27. Actually, here's what Genesis 1:27 says. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So he doesn't even describe the text accurately throughout this passage. And then some people go the other way. Well, day 6 was too short. Well, day 7 is too long. Norm Geisler says this in Systematic Theology. Everyone agrees that it has been at least thousands of years since the time of creation, yet the Bible declares that God rested on the 7th day after his 6 days of creation. According to the book of Hebrews, God is still in his Sabbath rest from creation.
True.
Hence, the 7th day...
Which ties into Genesis 1 on day 7, obviously. He's assuming rulership. Absolutely. So the 7th day is long in that, again, like Peter said in his epistle, 1,000 years is like one day to the Lord. Because God exists outside of time. But for us, this is still the 7th day. That's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. He rules his creation. That's what that verse means.
has been at least 6,000 years long, even on the shortest of all the chronologies of humankind. Did you guys see the logical flaw there as we were going through it? It says that God entered his rest.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, does it mean that day is still, so he entered his rest on the 7th day. Does that mean day 7 is still continuing? For example, if I went on vacation starting last Friday, and I happened to still be on vacation, and I said, hey, I left for vacation on Friday, and I'm still on vacation. Does that mean it's still Friday?
I think he's confusing. That's not the appropriate analogy. I don't think you understand what the writer of Hebrews is saying here. God is still in his Sabbath rest. That means he's ruling. So the 7th day is still here. Like, it's the 7th day. This is probably the time that day doesn't mean 24 hours. In that God is ruling. I have to see the context of this, though. Let's go do that. So if I'm not mistaken, that's exactly... I have to do the Nestle Allen. Because... what was that? Hebrews... was that Hebrews 4? I don't think that was Hebrews 4. Let me look. Yeah, 4, 3 through 5. Okay. For he has somewhere spoken of the 7th day in this way, and God rests on the 7th day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. So... Let's pick it up again in the first few verses here in chapter 4. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has somewhere spoken of the 7th day in this way. Where did he take up his rest? In Genesis? Isn't that in heaven? So we will not be able to enter. That's where he's ruling. That's what it means there in Genesis, that he's taking up his rest. He began ruling. Now, where does he rule? Heaven. So those who do not believe will not enter his rest, that is heaven, because they have not believed. He's ruling up there. So we will not enter into his rulership, if you will, in heaven. That's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. Specifically. But yes, he still rules. He's using Genesis 1 to say that God rules. He's still ruling, so day 7 is still there.
No, it means I'm still on vacation. But that's exactly what Norm Geisler did with this passage. And look at what it says in Hebrews chapter 4. And yet his work has been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. And on the seventh day God rested from his work. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. Where does it say day 7 is still going on? It just says that he ceased from working, from doing the work of creation. I like what John Whitcomb says.
Means he's taking up his rulership. He's still ruling. That's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. That he's ruling still. So we're still in day 7 because he still rules and reigns.
Says, we must assume that the seventh day was a literal day because Adam and Eve lived through it before God drove them out of the garden. Surely he would not have cursed the earth during the seventh day, which he blessed and sanctified. Yeah, remember in Hebrews chapter 11, it tells us that God blessed and sanctified the seventh day.
Mm-hmm.
That he made it holy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when Adam and Eve sinned, God cursed the ground.
It's a reflection of the work week as well, that we also rest. That we also rest.
He cursed the serpent, and he announced these punishments that would happen to man and woman. Did that really happen on the same day that God blessed and sanctified everything? Of course not. I mentioned Meredith Kline earlier and the framework hypothesis. This is kind of a technical view, so we're going to look at one of their probably the easiest argument to understand, and we'll show why there's problems. What the framework hypothesis has done is try to redefine the literary genre of Genesis chapter 1.
Now, I think I've described the framework hypothesis here a little bit here. You actually see the first 3 days God creates space, and then the latter 3 days he fills it. That's what's going on in Genesis 1.
That's why he called it semi-poetic. They're trying to say Genesis 1 doesn't really even speak about the age of the earth at all. And so one of the arguments they use for that is what's known as parallelism. So they say days 1 and 4, don't think of days 1 through 6 as a sequence of events, but look at it as like this framework that the narrator, that the writer is using just to describe theological truths. Don't think of it chronologically. So they say days 1 and 4 don't describe separate activities of God separated by 3 days, but contemporaneous activities described from different perspectives.
1 through 3.
He's another Mark Furtado. Days 1 and 4 are different perspectives of the same creative work. Van Gemeren says the days also show parallelism, each day having a counterpart. The 6 days of creation may be placed in synthetic parallelism, each day finding its complement in another. The first and the fourth day are thus a pair, as are the second and the fifth, and the third and the sixth. So here's what they're saying, if you were able to follow along.
He's going through, this is my argument, this is the one I hold to, is the framework hypothesis. So I just thought I'd let you know.
Don't think of these in terms of chronology. Think of them as just a literary device. So the first 3 days are days of formation, and the last 3 days are days of filling. Van Gemeren has this chart in his book where he puts these things together. Look at, you have darkness and light on day 1. You've got heavenly light bearers on day 4. You got the heavens and the water on day 2. You got the birds of the air and the water animals on day 5. See, look at the parallelism. You got seas and land and vegetation, and then you got land animals and man. And so look at that parallel. Except for the things that he has in the chart aren't even accurate. Let's look at what the Bible teaches on these. On day 1, God made the heavens, the earth, and it says the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the waters, and let there be light. So you've got those 4 things, day 1. Day 2, you have the expanse, or the firmament. Day 3, you've got the dry land, grass, seed-yielding plants, fruit-bearing trees. Day 4, you got the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, sea creatures and birds of the air. And day 6, you got land animals, Adam and Eve.
But in a way, it does. It does. They've got it down. Heavens and water. Heavens and water. You've got day 1, heavens and water there. Then you've got the sun, moon, and stars. for day 4. So the heavens, sun, moon, and stars. That's your heavens and light. And the light fills the earth. Day 2, you've got the expanse, the firmament. So you got the birds of the air there, sea creatures, and then dry land, which is animals and humanity. You see that there. It does. It works. I don't know how he doesn't see that. I don't know how he doesn't see this. That's exactly what the framework hypothesis says.
And let's make
Absolutely.
some corrections. Waters were made on day 1, not on day 2. The Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the waters. The expanse
his graph
on day
may be
2,
slightly
the firmament,
incorrect, but it still fits.
Is what the stars were put in on day 4. So maybe days 2 and 4 are parallel here. And the waters were on day 1, the fish were on day 5, so maybe those 2 days are parallel. Oh, but except for the waters were actually named on day 3, the seas, so maybe that's what's parallel with day 5. You could draw lines anywhere you want here, but you can't change what God actually made on each of these to make your parallel fit. And by the way, the whole parallelism idea is nonsense because you have to have the event of what happened before in order for something else to happen. In other words, you have to have the waters on day 1 in order for God to separate the waters on day 2. A little over a decade ago, I was in Connecticut to do a debate with somebody who held to this view. In fact, we had 4 debates on this topic who held to the framework hypothesis. And we had a very friendly discussion in each of the places that we went. And I asked him at one point, I said, so would you say that there is some sort of sequence that day 1-4, is what we called it for the sake of argument, is before day 2-5, and that's before day 3-6. And he thought about it for a minute. He said, yeah, I would say that. And I said, so how does God put the sun, moon, and stars into something that doesn't exist yet? Because of day 1-4,
which proves it's poetry,
has to come before day 2-5, and he didn't know how to answer that because there is no answer to that. You have to have the order of events lined out in Scripture, or else you can't have what's happening on the day actually occur, because you have to have those things in place. The birds being on dry land on day 5, that's where they multiply, is on dry ground. The dry ground has to be there, but the framework...
Again, this is the problem with taking a wooden, literal interpretation of Genesis 1. He is taking this way too literally. It's way too literary that it makes it sound absurd when it actually isn't. It's not absurd. If we go to Genesis 1 again here. I know I've been on this for far too long. Oops, we gotta go to this. Genesis 1. Genesis 1 for you guys and me. So there we go. So Genesis 1, let there be light. That was it. Light. And the heavens and earth. So he's created space. And actually, if you want to take this a step further, the JPS translation says we should translate verse 1 here, when God began to create the heavens and earth, which means they were there. That means he did not create de novo. So let's see, you got those 3. You got earth, heavens, and light. So he's creating space, and then he's going to fill that space. Day 2, he created the expanse, the rakia, right? Yeah, the rakia, the firmament. So he's creating more space. Then it goes down the list, and then with the latter days, 4 through 6, he fills the space. He fills it. The problem Chafee's doing is he's straw-manning the argument. He's like, well, birds multiply on the ground. That's not the point of the parallelism here. The writers of Hebrew, the writers of the Old Testament, were notorious for using parallelism, heightening, intensification, specification, concretization. They specialized in this, so to speak. That it's all over the place in Genesis 1, so the writers can glorify God. That is what's going on. That is what's going on. You're taking this woodenly and literally. If you do take this woodenly and literally, this is what you wind up with. It sounds absurd, and it's not. if you take that literally, you're creating problems for the young earth creationist view. That's what Chafee's doing when he says there was no sun. So how is the, like, how can, I forget what he said, dang it, I'm muddling what he says, but he said a few minutes ago, there was no sun in verse 1, or verse 2. So how was the light there? Yes, that's our problem. That's your problem. You have to, if you take that literally as historical narrative, you have to take that literally. You have to say, yes, God created light but didn't create the sun. Well, how was there light? Because it's poetry. He's creating space. That's how we argue. That's what's going on here. And it makes sense. It makes sense. This is not a science book.
Hypothesis doesn't give you the dry ground yet.
Now he's
Ross says, well, getting around this idea that you can't have death before sin, which we'll talk about a little bit more. That's one of the biggest problems with the old earth creationist view, is you're putting death, suffering, and disease before Adam sinned. He says this, well, the death of at least plants or plant parts must have occurred before Adam sinned.
Mm-hmm. I'll stop right here because he's switched gears here, but I want to conclude with this, other than a straw manning, is that this is framework. The framework hypothesis, I think, is the best explanation of the text in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is a temple text. I've said this earlier. I think I've said it in the first video. Genesis 1 is a temple text in that it reveals how God created the universe through poetry and prose. And if you take this literally, you will have problems, and one glaring contradiction. The days match each other. God creates space in days 1 through 3. Then he fills it in verses 4 through 6. Day 1, he creates the heavens, the earth. He creates the heavens, the earth, and light. The heavens and earth are space. Day 2, day 3, and then you get to day 4, 5, and 6, and you see that the days match up. You saw that there. That's Gemiren's framework hypothesis. I tweak it a little bit. I think day 3, and then it should be split down the middle, in my opinion, not just 1 through 4 and then 5, 6, 7. Or 5, 6, because 7... But first 6 days, the 6 days, they match you. Day 1, 3, day 2, day 5, day 3, day 6. They match. What he just did was strawman the argument. And because he's taking this out literally. And you can't do that. You can't do that. So, next week we will conclude the third part of this. It might go a little longer than the 50-something minutes. We went a little longer. But this really gets me worked up. And I'm sorry if I stumbled over my words. Maybe next time I'll be more prepared as far as stumbling over words is concerned. But this is a reaction video, so this is the reason you're getting my genuine reaction. So, without any further ado, I guess we will conclude, and I will see you guys next week.